Tonight, my friends, I want to tell you a story that was whispered through castle walls, where power wasn't only crowned, it was married. Where behind the velvet curtains of the throne room, another world quietly unfolded, one of queens, concubines, secrets, and vows. In the grand halls of medieval Europe, a king's authority seemed infinite. He could raise armies, crush rebellions, command cathedrals to be built in his name. But when it came to marriage, even a king was bound by rules. Strange, isn't it? That the man who ruled over thousands still needed permission to take a second wife. But those permissions, they weren't always followed. And when they were, they often came with a price. In those ancient times, a royal marriage was never simply about love. It was a matter of lineage, alliance, and legacy. One wife meant one heir. But what if she didn't bear a son? What if years passed and the cradle remained empty? That's where the whispers began. Advisors, priests, noble families, all wondering, should the king be allowed another chance? Should another woman be brought to the palace quietly to try again? And if so, what happens to the first? To the one crowned with flowers, kissed before the cathedral, and promised a life beside him forever? This wasn't just a question of affection. It was a question of law, of church, of conscience. The church officially forbade polygamy, one man, one wife. But reality, especially in royal courts, was never so pure. Kings often found ways to bend the rule without breaking it. Some took lovers and called them maids. Others arranged secret unions blessed by bishops who had been paid handsomely to forget. And in rare, quiet cases, a second wife would arrive through the back gates of the castle, never publicly announced, but never truly hidden. The halls would grow more silent. The first queen would smile thinner, and the king, crowned by God, would walk among them both, never questioned, never punished, only watched. The question of how many wives a medieval king could truly have was less about numbers and more about appearances. Officially, only one woman could be queen, blessed before the altar, witnessed by nobles, bound in public covenant. But beyond the ceremony, things blurred. If a queen failed to bear a son, the kingdom held its breath. The line of succession was everything, the future of peace, of war, of taxes, even of God's supposed favor. And so whispers turned to advice, advice into pressure, pressure into action. A king might consult his clergy, but he already knew the answer he wanted. "You must provide an heir," they'd say. "The kingdom cannot wait." What followed wasn't always a divorce. Sometimes it was a quiet addition. One royal historian wrote that a king's second woman enters through the garden, never the gate. That phrase echoed in many courts. These women were not always mistresses. Some were married in secret, given rooms in distant towers, guarded not by knights, but by silence. They were spoken of as cousins, guests, or caretakers. But their purpose was understood. And often they bore sons, sons who looked like the king, who were educated like princes, but who could never claim the throne unless the church was persuaded or paid. These children lived in a limbo of legitimacy, both royal and not. Their mothers, too, lived between titles, not concubines, not queens, but something unnamed. And what of the first wife, the queen? History rarely tells her story in full. Sometimes she was sent away to a convent. Other times she remained, dining beside the man who had brought another into their halls. Her face carved into tapestries, her name sung in hymns, even as her voice faded from the court. It was a peculiar cruelty to be both honored and ignored. And in many cases, the people never knew the truth. The kingdom saw only what it was allowed to see: one crown, one queen. But inside those stone walls, the truth was layered, and the crown weighed heavier than anyone admitted. There was one queen, always. That was the rule. But if you looked closely at the royal chambers, you might notice 2 sets of brushes near the basin, or 2 pairs of slippers outside the king's room. One of them might be smaller, worn at the edges with embroidery not fit for ceremony, but sewn with love, and you might wonder who they belonged to. You wouldn't ask. No one did, but everyone noticed. Castles were made of stone, but secrets passed through them like wind through a field, brushing past ears, rattling doors, and leaving the curtains to dance. These women, the second ones, were part of the castle's air. They never entered. The portraits, their names were not recorded, but they were there, waiting in silence. Not every king sought more than one wife out of desire. Some did it from fear. The fear of dying without a son, of letting a rival claim the throne, of failing the bloodline he was born to continue. The weight of legacy pressed heavier than the weight of love. And so, even the kindest kings sometimes allowed silence to replace affection. Their first wives, often married in youth, selected for politics, not passion, watched as years chipped away the vows, spoken in front of so many. They held their dignity in place like a crown, even when their hearts had long since been removed from the throne. And so the question returns, how many wives could a medieval king really have? The answer is not found in law, nor scroll, nor scripture. It lies in the spaces between, in the tower room that never had a name, in the woman who bore a prince and disappeared, in the prayer said not aloud but behind a closed curtain. The truth is, a king often had only one wife in name, but many in consequence, and history, written by those who crowned him, never asked for the names of the women who waited behind locked doors. But we will. Tonight, we will. Once there was a king named Alaric, ruler of a cold and wind-swept kingdom in the northern hills. His crown was heavy with sapphires, and his court admired for discipline, not decadence. Alaric was no tyrant. He ruled with fairness, signed treaties with steadiness, and held deep respect for the church. But he had only daughters, 3 of them. And though he loved them more than he ever admitted aloud, the court began to whisper. "Who will sit upon the throne when Alaric is gone?" they asked. Will he let a girl rule? Or worse, will he marry one off to a foreign prince and hand our kingdom away in her dowry? These murmurs, like ivy, crept quietly through the stone halls, tangling around the minds of his advisers. The church remained firm. One wife, one marriage. Queen Isolde had given him 3 healthy children, and her devotion to the realm was unmatched. She oversaw the healing houses, maintained peace among the noble women, and had once calmed an entire rebellion with nothing but a speech from the castle steps. But none of that mattered to the bishops, or the council, or the bloodline, the crown. They insisted was not just a symbol, it was a seed, and that seed to them required a son. Alaric resisted at first. For years he refused the suggestions. He believed in the strength of his daughters. He believed in Isolde. But belief, he learned, does not stop history from pressing down. And one winter, after his youngest turned 12, the pressure shifted from whispers to threats. His brother's son, a cruel, ambitious boy from the southern courts, began gathering allies. If Alaric has no son, he said aloud at a feast Perhaps the throne seeks one elsewhere. That was the moment the king realized that love and loyalty could not protect the line. And in that bitter silence, a second woman was summoned, not by passion, not by romance, but by duty. Her name was Leora, and she entered the castle on a day when no bells were rung. Leora arrived wrapped in grey wool, her carriage plain, unmarked, no trumpets, no procession, only the crunch of frost beneath the hooves of her escort's horses and the creak of the castle gate, opening slightly before closing just as quickly. Few servants knew who she was, fewer dared ask, but the queen knew. Isolde watched from a high window, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of cooling tea. She said nothing. That evening at supper, the king sat beside her as he always did. His hand rested on the table, inches from hers, but he didn't touch her. He didn't speak much. And though the meal was served with all its usual care, roasted roots, honeyed bread, spiced wine, no one tasted anything. It was as if the entire room held its breath. Leora was not seated at the feast. She dined alone in a tower chamber that had been unused for over a decade, once belonging to Alaric's late sister. The room had been cleared hastily, the furniture dusted but not polished, the fireplace lit but weak. She said nothing of the cold. She simply ate, bathed, and waited. No ceremony welcomed her. No title was given, but her arrival echoed in every hallway, every glance exchanged between chambermaids, and the queen, without asking, began to feel the air around her thin out, like warmth, leaving a room after the fire dies down. Days passed, and Leora remained unseen. Whispers began. Some claimed she was a distant cousin, others said a foreign envoy's daughter. But those closest to the truth said nothing. Not because they feared the king, but because they pitied the queen. Isolde still wore her crown, still stood beside Alaric at sermons, still smiled in the portrait chamber, but behind her eyes, something fragile had been folded away, like parchment pressed too tightly. Leora was not an enemy. She hadn't come to steal anything, but her presence alone was theft enough. Not of power, but of certainty. Of the space that once belonged only to one woman, now quietly, painfully shared with another. The castle changed, not in stone or structure, but in feeling. It became quieter in the evenings. The torches seemed to flicker more slowly. Even the servants walked more gently, as if the walls themselves had become fragile. Leora remained in her chamber, rarely seen, but her presence was undeniable. The king visited her under the pretense of counsel, but everyone knew better. Her window began to glow at odd hours of the night, and her maid was seen fetching dried lavender and milk warmed with cloves. Signs not of royalty, but of comfort. Signs of waiting. The kind of waiting only women understood. Queen Isolde noticed. She said nothing, but her hands, once still and graceful, began to tremble ever, so slightly when she read letters from her daughter's tutors, as if even their handwriting reminded her of a world slipping from her grasp. Alaric, once a man of resolute vision, found himself caught between two silences. He did not speak to Isolde of Leora, nor did he speak to Leora of Isolde. And so, in his attempt to divide his heart cleanly, he split it instead. The queen no longer asked where he spent his evenings. She no longer lit the candle in the window, once a signal to guide him back from long counsels. it remained dark. The daughters too began to notice. They whispered among themselves, though never in front of their mother. One drew a second woman into her embroidery by accident. Another began plucking her lute in minor chords even during feasts. Small rebellions stitched into quiet, and still the church remained silent, as long as the queen remained queen, and no one spoke the truth aloud. But something had shifted permanently. The castle now held 2 stories, one spoken during daylight, and another that drifted through the halls at night like smoke. And in this smoke, Queen Isolde moved without sound, no longer just a ruler's wife, but a woman who had been asked to make space for history and to vanish inside it without leaving a mark. The next morning, Queen Isolde stood by the window watching the mist rise from the hills behind the castle. The sky was grey, soft and still. She hadn't slept much. The bed beside her felt bigger now, even though it hadn't changed. There was no fight, no shouting, no broken words. But something inside her had gone quiet, like the last glow of a fire that no one bothered to feed. Outside, the world moved as always. The cook lit the ovens. The guards changed shift. The maids swept the halls. But inside Isolde's chest, it felt like everything had slowed down. She wrapped her shawl tighter and closed the window. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore, it was in her. That same morning, Leora walked slowly through the south garden. It was her first time outside the tower room since she arrived. Her steps were careful. She didn't want to be seen. But the castle was large and the garden quiet. No one stopped her. She bent down near a frozen rose bush and touched one of the brittle petals. She whispered something to herself. Maybe a memory, maybe a prayer. She looked younger than people imagined, not bold, not dangerous, just placed here, like a page, in someone else's book. She didn't want a crown, she didn't want to replace anyone, but she was here now, and the child inside her, if there truly was one, would soon make everything louder. Back inside, the king sat alone in the library. He stared at a map, but his eyes weren't reading. His fingers rested on the edge of the parchment, still heavy. He had thought solving the line of succession would bring peace. Instead, the castle felt even more divided. 2 women, 1 future, and a kingdom waiting for answers he didn't know how to give. The silence between them all was growing, not sharp like a sword, but soft, like snow covering a path no one remembered how to walk. That evening, the king asked for a private supper, just him and the queen. It had been weeks since they had spoken without others around. The meal was small bread, warm broth, and spiced apples. They sat across from each other in the old stone dining room, where ivy curled around the tall windows. The candles flickered, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. Then quietly, Alaric spoke. "You have been patient with me," he said, "more than I deserve." Isolde looked up, her hands resting in her lap. She nodded, but didn't smile. "I know what you think," he continued, "that I've chosen her, that I've forgotten you." He paused, his voice heavier now. "But I haven't. I swear I haven't." Isolde didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long time, not with anger, but with a kind of tired kindness. "I don't think you've forgotten me," she said softly. "I think you've forgotten what we built." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were glassy. We made something strong. We led this kingdom together. I stood with you when others doubted you. I prayed for your victories. I gave you daughters who carry your name with pride. And now I sit in silence while the future is written without
Me? Her words didn't accuse, they simply existed.
like truths that had waited too long. The king leaned back, looking smaller than usual. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I was afraid of what would happen if I left the throne uncertain. Isolde reached for her cup, but didn't. Drink. You were afraid of not having a son, she said. But did you ever ask what I was afraid of? The candles hissed slightly, and outside, a soft wind moved the trees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. In that silence, they both realized it wasn't betrayal that had broken them. It was fear. A quiet fear that had grown roots in the very place where love once lived. That night, after their quiet meal, Queen Isolde returned to her chamber alone. She removed her crown gently, as if it might break in her hands. It had never felt heavier. She placed it on the velvet cushion by the mirror, then sat by the fire in her nightdress. The flames danced softly, casting gold shadows across the stone walls. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe without holding anything back. There were no servants watching, no advisors waiting for her to speak. Just the quiet of the room and the sound of her own heart trying to remember who she was before all of this began. She had been a queen for so long that she had forgotten. The girl who once dreamed of love, not duty. Down the hall, Leora lay awake in her bed. She stared at the ceiling, her hands resting over her stomach. She still didn't know if she was truly with child. The signs were there: missed days, waves of nausea, the sudden sweetness of dreams. But the truth hadn't fully come yet, and still the castle watched her like she already carried the next heir. She wasn't ready for this. Not the eyes, not the weight, not the silent blame she saw in Isolde's face. Leora didn't want to replace anyone. She only wanted to matter to someone, to herself. And now that wish had brought her into a world where love was too dangerous to name. Elsewhere, the king stood alone in the chapel. The candles flickered around him, but he didn't pray. He just looked up at the high ceiling, the painted saints above him staring down with unreadable eyes. He thought of his daughters, of the crown, of Isolde's voice when she said, "Did you ever ask what I was afraid of?" He hadn't, and now he couldn't stop hearing it. That night, all three of them, king, queen, and the other woman, lay awake in different rooms under the same roof, breathing the same cold air, wondering how something once so full of love could end without a single scream. Weeks passed, and winter grew deeper. Snow began to cover the courtyards, and the garden paths disappeared under thick white blankets. Life inside the castle moved slowly. Fires were kept burning in every room, and thick tapestries were hung to keep the cold away. But no one could keep the cold from entering their hearts. Leora's condition was no longer a rumor. It was visible. Her hands rested on her growing belly when she walked. Her cheeks had softened, her steps became slower. The maids now brought her extra blankets, and the cook sent special meals, richer and warmer. Yet none of it came with celebration. There was no feast, no music, no name spoken out loud for the unborn child. Only quiet, the kind that feels like holding your breath. Queen Isolde watched it all from a distance. She said nothing. Not to the king, not to Leora, not even to her daughters. But in her silence, something began to grow. Not bitterness, not hatred. Something calmer, like a lake that has frozen over. She still wore her crown, still attended councils, still walked through the castle with grace. But now, every step she took was chosen carefully, as if walking through a place that no longer belonged to her. The servants respected her more than ever, but their eyes held sympathy instead of admiration. That was the hardest part, being pitied by people who once looked up to her. The king avoided both women. His duties became his escape. He spent long hours in the council chamber, reading reports, signing letters, and studying maps that no longer mattered. He told himself he was preparing the kingdom, but deep down he knew he was hiding. Every time he passed a mirror, he saw a man who had tried to control the future and lost the present. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside the castle, 3 lives moved like separate shadows, each one waiting for something to break the silence, a cry, a name, a moment that would finally tell them what all of this was for. The day Leora went into labor, it was snowing harder than anyone had seen in years. The wind howled through. The towers and the sky hung low and heavy, like a thick blanket pressed against the world. No bells were rung, no announcements were made. Only a few midwives were summoned quietly, slipping into her chamber with baskets of cloth, hot water, and whispered prayers. The birth lasted through the night. No one outside the room knew what was happening, but everyone felt it. The castle held its breath. Servants tiptoed, fires were stoked, not for comfort, but to keep the shadows from growing too wide. And Queen Isolde in her chamber sat upright in bed, unable to close her eyes, her hands clenched in her lap. By morning, the sky cleared, the snow stopped, and the cry of a newborn echoed softly through the stone walls. Just once. Then silence. Moments later, a maid moved swiftly through the hallway, her eyes red, her hands shaking slightly as she carried a cloth-wrapped bundle toward the king's private study. No one stopped her. No one needed to ask. Behind her, the door to Leora's
room stayed shut. Inside, she lay pale and still, her breathing slow but steady. The midwives said nothing. They simply cleaned the room, moved quietly, and placed a single candle near the bed.
A sign of rest, a sign of survival. The king took the child in his arms, a boy, healthy, small but strong. His eyes barely opened, and yet his presence felt heavier than the crown itself. Alaric stared at him for a long time, not speaking, not smiling. There was no joy in his face, only the weight of knowing everything had changed. Outside the door, one of the guards lowered his head and whispered, "It's a boy." And though no one dared say it aloud, the word traveled through the castle like fire through dry leaves. A boy, an heir. And suddenly everything they had feared, hidden and sacrificed for, had finally arrived. Queen Isolde heard the news not from the king, but from the soft voice of her youngest daughter. The girl had overheard a guard and came running, eyes wide, unsure if she should feel happy or scared. "It's a boy," she whispered, as if saying it too loud might wake something. Isolde simply nodded. She stood up, walked to her window and looked out across the snow-covered courtyard. Everything looked the same. The trees, the towers, the path worn by boots and wheels. But she knew in her heart that the world had shifted. A boy had been born. A future had been written, and she was no longer part of the sentence. She didn't cry. Instead, she sat down at her writing desk and opened a drawer filled with old letters, some from Alaric, written long ago when they were just newlyweds, others from her daughters when they were learning to write. She read one slowly, tracing the words with her fingers. "Mama, I love you more than the moon," it said in shaky handwriting. Isolde smiled, but it was a tired smile. She folded the letter again and placed it back. In that moment, she realized something simple and sad. She had built her whole life around a future that would now carry someone else's name. Meanwhile, the king sat alone in the chapel again, the newborn boy resting quietly in a cradle beside him. He had asked the room to be cleared. No priests, no advisors, just him and the child. He looked at the boy, then at the stained glass above, the saints with calm faces, frozen in perfect grace. He whispered, "Is this what I was waiting for?" But the room gave no answer. The baby stirred. A small sound escaped his lips, something between a sigh and a yawn. And in that soft breath, Alaric felt both the beauty and the cost of everything he had chosen. For the first time, he didn't feel like a king. He felt like a man who had broken something sacred just to prove he could hold the future. The days after the boy's birth felt both silent and strange. The castle didn't celebrate. There were no feasts, no music in the halls, no laughter echoing through the chambers. And yet, everything had changed. The baby, now named Edric, was given a small room beside the king's quarters with warm tapestries, a cradle carved from ashwood, and a nursemaid who never left his side. Guards stood at the door day and night. But still there was no joy in the air, only duty, only watchfulness. As if everyone knew that something important had happened, but no one knew how to feel about it. Leora, still pale and quiet, remained in her tower. She was healing, but slowly. Her body was tired, and so was her heart. She asked to see the child once a day. The nursemaid brought him to her room, placed him in her arms, and then left without a word. Leora would hold Edric close, breathe in his soft scent, and whisper lullabies she remembered from her childhood. Songs her own mother used to sing, but when she kissed his forehead, she did it with fear, not pride. She knew what people whispered behind her back. That she was the mother of the king's heir, but never a queen. That she had changed the kingdom with her presence, without ever being invited to stay. Queen Isolde, on the other side of the castle, carried herself with quiet grace. She attended court sessions. She spoke kindly to her daughters, but something inside her had frozen. She had not asked to see the boy, not even once. When people offered congratulations, she simply nodded and changed the subject. She didn't hate the child. She couldn't. But she didn't belong to this new chapter. And she knew it. Every step she took now felt borrowed. The throne still stood behind her. Her crown still rested on her head, but her heart had already stepped away, and the halls she once ruled began to feel like they belonged to someone else entirely. One afternoon, the king asked for a portrait, not of himself, not of Isolde, but of the boy. A royal painter was summoned, and the session took place in the west chamber, the one with the largest window where light poured in like honey. Edric was dressed in soft blue cloth, too big for his tiny frame. He blinked at the brightness, his fingers curled like flower petals. The nursemaid stood nearby, silent. The painter worked quickly, brush gliding over canvas. The boy didn't cry. He only watched, his eyes still too new to understand where he was or what it meant. But everyone else in the room understood. This was history being written in color. The finished portrait was hung in the great hall, just beside the tapestry of the royal family. But this time, the image stood alone. No mother, no queen, just the boy, painted in delicate detail. The future, wrapped in linen, framed in gold. Visitors paused in front of it, unsure how to react. Some bowed. Others looked away. But none of them could ignore it. The painting made it real. The boy wasn't just a rumor now, he was part of the wall, part of the bloodline, part of the kingdom's
memory. When Queen Isolde first walked past it, she didn't stop.
She didn't speak. She kept her pace steady, her face unreadable. But later, in the stillness of her chamber, she closed the door and wept. Not out of jealousy, not out of anger, but because she had once imagined that wall differently. She had pictured her daughters there, strong, brave, crowned with flowers instead of silence. She had pictured herself holding a child who carried both her name and her hope. Instead, the wall now told a story she didn't write, a future she wasn't in. And no one asked her if she was ready to be left behind. The portrait was beautiful, but it was also a reminder. Some legacies are painted without asking permission from those who held the brush before. That night, Queen Isolde called for her daughters. One by one, they entered her room. Girls no longer small, but not yet grown. They sat near the fire, curled on cushions, quiet and curious. Isolde didn't speak right away. She just looked at them, memorizing their faces. The soft curves of their chins, the questions in their eyes, the strength they didn't yet know they had. Finally, she spoke. "You are my legacy," she said gently. "Not the crown, not the titles, you." The girls looked at each other, then back at her. "People will speak of your brother," she continued. "They'll write his name in books, paint his face on walls, but what matters most is not who sits on a throne, it's who stands with kindness when the world tries to turn cold." The oldest daughter, barely 13, reached out and held her mother's hand. "Are we still part
of the kingdom?" she asked softly.
Isolde smiled, but her eyes filled with tears. "You are the heart of it," she whispered. "They just don't see it yet." The room was quiet. Only the fire crackled. Outside, snowflakes tapped against the glass. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not fear, not sadness, but a quiet promise that even if the world forgot their names, they would remember each other. Elsewhere in the castle, Leora sat in her chamber, rocking Edric slowly. She could feel the distance between her and the rest of the world. The boy in her arms was a symbol now, not just a baby, but a crown in human form. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "You didn't ask for this, did you?" The child didn't stir. His eyes remained closed. And though she had given the kingdom what it wanted, she felt more alone than ever. In every hallway she saw glances, polite, cold, careful. She had changed everything, but belonged nowhere. And in the quiet hours of the night, with only the fire to keep her warm, she wondered if being remembered was worth the price of being unloved. 2 winters passed. The castle aged with the seasons, its stone halls colder, its voices fewer. Edric had grown, no longer a baby, but a small boy with wide eyes and golden curls. He learned to walk in the garden paths bundled in wool, his steps watched by guards and whispered by maids. The king often held his hand during court, letting the child sit beside him on a smaller chair built just for him. Nobles bowed with forced smiles. Some spoke of destiny, others remained quiet. But all of them understood the boy was no longer just a question. He was the answer, even if the cost of that answer was never fully spoken aloud. Queen Isolde watched from the margins. She hadn't left the castle, but she had left the story. She spent her days in the old library, reading books no one touched anymore. Her daughters were growing fast, each year, pulling them farther from childhood and closer to the world of titles, marriages, and expectation. She prepared them quietly, taught them not just to read and write, but to listen, to feel what isn't said. Power, she told them one afternoon, is not always in the crown. Sometimes it lives in silence. They listened, and they remembered, even if no one else did. Leora, though mother of the heir, lived as if between shadows. Her status was clear but unnamed. No royal titles, no crown, just careful respect and thin smiles from the court. She walked the halls with grace, but never with ease. When she entered a room, conversation shifted. When she passed, shoulders turned slightly. She had what the kingdom wanted, but never became what the kingdom accepted. And yet, her love for Edric was deep and real. At night, she would sing to him, hold his hand as he slept, and whispered dreams into his ear. But sometimes, after he drifted off, she would sit in the dark, staring at the wall, wondering if love was enough to protect him from a world that only saw him as a throne on two legs. That same winter, an old monk arrived at the castle gates. He was wrapped in layers of coarse brown cloth, face hidden beneath a deep hood. His name was Brother Aldrich, and he carried nothing but a leather satchel and a letter bearing the royal seal. He was allowed inside without question. The king greeted him briefly, recognizing him from years ago, a scholar once tasked with preserving royal family records. "Just passing through," the monk said, bowing. But his eyes held something deeper. That night, instead of leaving, he was offered a room in the east wing. And from that day forward, whispers began to rise like smoke in the winter air. The monk spent long hours in the archive chambers beneath the castle. He read scrolls by candlelight, moving between old documents with a strange urgency. Servants said they heard him talking to himself, not with madness, but as if speaking to memories that refused to stay buried. One night, the steward found him staring at a worn document sealed in wax. When asked about it, the monk only replied, "Some truths sleep quietly, others wait to be heard." Word reached the king, but Alaric dismissed it. "He's an old man chasing ghosts," he said. But even as he said it, something inside him tensed, like a string pulled too tight. Isolde, however, paid attention. She had known Brother Aldrich once, back when he was a young man with clear eyes and too many questions. She remembered his honesty and his hunger for facts no one else dared to write down. One evening, she asked for him to join her by the fire. They spoke quietly as snow fell outside. "Tell me what you found," she said. The monk hesitated, then looked directly into her eyes. "I found a name," he whispered. written in a place it was never meant to appear. Not in that year. Not in that order. Isolde's breath caught. In a castle ruled by silence, one wrong name in one
old book
could set the entire future on fire. That night, Queen Isolde didn't sleep. She walked the halls alone, candle in hand, her steps muffled by the thick carpets beneath her. The castle was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that listens. She moved through familiar corridors, past portraits of old kings and queens, faces painted with pride, and secrets. When she reached the old chapel, she paused. The room smelled of wax and stone. A place built for prayer, but filled now with unanswered questions. She knelt not to pray, but to think. Brother Aldrich's words echoed in her mind. A name in the wrong place, a date that doesn't match, a witness forgotten. Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, King Alaric stood before the fire, holding the same document the monk had uncovered. It was nothing grand, just a record of royal declarations from 8 years ago. But on the third page, in faded ink, was the name Edric, dated a full year before the child's supposed birth. Alongside it, another signature, not Leora's, someone else. A name crossed out, but still faintly visible beneath the ink. He stared at it for a long time. The room felt colder. His hands trembled slightly. Could a mistake this small unravel a future this big? Leora, unaware, slept beside Edric's cradle, her hand resting on the edge, as if to guard him from dreams too heavy for a child. She had no idea what name the monk had found or what it meant, but deep inside, she had long carried a quiet fear. Not that Edric wasn't loved, but that his place in the world was too fragile, built too quickly, written in ink instead of stone, and in a kingdom that worshipped bloodlines more than hearts, even the smallest crack in a royal truth could become a wound that never closed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering rooftops and paths. But inside, a truth had begun to stir, and no one could unsee it now. In the days that followed, the air inside the castle shifted. Not in temperature, but in weight, like something invisible pressing against the walls. People began to speak more softly. Footsteps grew quieter. Even the bells in the courtyard seemed more hesitant when they rang. The truth had not yet been spoken aloud, but it had already taken root. Queen Isolde moved with more certainty now, her eyes sharper, her questions more pointed. She had returned to the court not with anger, but with presence. The kind that could not be ignored. And those who once pitied her now watched her closely, unsure if they were witnessing a return or a reckoning. The king, for the first time in years, avoided the throne room. He spent his hours behind closed doors, reviewing documents, summoning scribes, reading and rereading old records with a desperation he tried to hide. The more he looked, the more questions surfaced. Edric's birth had always been taken as fact. No one had asked for proof. No one had dared. But now, with the name Brother Aldrich had uncovered, and the date that didn't match, cracks began to appear in the story he had built. And every crack whispered the same fear. What if the heir is not truly his? Leora felt the change without knowing its source. The servants who once offered quiet bows now looked at her with uncertainty. The nursemaid began to keep Edric closer, even when unnecessary. And when Leora entered a room, conversation didn't stop. It shifted, like a stream redirected, She asked the king once if something was wrong, and he only kissed her hand and said, "Everything is as it should be." But his eyes betrayed him. They no longer looked at her. They looked through her, searching for answers he hadn't dared to ask before. And in that distance, Leora felt something she hadn't felt since before Edric was born. Fear. Not for herself, but for her son, a child born into a throne that now felt like a question carved in gold. One evening, as the snow turned to rain, Brother Aldrich requested a private audience with the Queen. Isolde agreed, meeting him in the old tower study where time itself seemed to stand still. The walls were lined with dust-covered scrolls and forgotten books, the kind of place where secrets could breathe without being seen. The monk placed a small wooden box on the table between them. Inside it, carefully folded, were letters written in a delicate hand, addressed not to the king, but to a man named Sir Aemon, a knight who had once served in the royal guard, and vanished without explanation 8 winters ago. The handwriting was Leora's. Isolde read each letter slowly, her hands steady, her breath silent. The letters spoke of fear, of longing, of a bond kept hidden behind stone walls and royal silence. One line stopped her cold. "If they ever discover he's not Alaric's, we will both be buried for treason." She closed the box gently and looked at Aldrich, her voice low. "Where is Aemon now?" The monk shook his head. "Missing, presumed, dead." But these letters were hidden behind the altar in the old chapel beneath a loose stone. Someone kept them safe. Perhaps her, perhaps not. Isolde leaned back. The fire crackled between them, but the warmth didn't reach her anymore. In the following days, Isolde didn't act, not publicly, but she watched. She noticed how Leora avoided the West Wing, how the king barely touched his food, how the guards at Edric's door had been doubled, and she wondered, not with vengeance, but with sorrow. If a child is born in love but raised in a lie, who suffers more? The kingdom that believes in him, or the mother who must pretend he belongs to someone else? The truth was no longer a shadow. It had a shape now, a voice, a paper trail, and it moved quietly but steadily, like water finding its way through stone, preparing to break through. It was the king who finally broke the silence. One night, unable to sleep, he entered Leora's chamber unannounced. She stood near the cradle, brushing Edric's hair gently as he slept. When she saw Alaric, her eyes searched his face for warmth, but found only weight. He closed the door behind him and said nothing for a long while. Then, in a voice softer than she had ever heard, he asked, "Did you love him?" Leora didn't need to ask who. She sat down slowly, hands in her lap, and answered with only a nod. Not ashamed, not defensive, just honest. And in that single gesture, everything he feared was confirmed, and yet strangely, so was everything he had once admired about her. He turned away, pacing the room like a man walking through a dream that no longer made sense. "And the boy?" he asked. "Is he mine?" Leora hesitated. Her lips parted. Her hands trembled, but no words came. Silence spoke louder than any answer could. Alaric sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. The weight of the crown, the years of secrets, the legacy built on shifting ground, all of it collapsed inward. And yet, through the pain, he still looked at the boy with something more than resentment. There was no anger in his voice, only a broken kind of sorrow. "I wanted to build something that would last," he whispered, "and now I don't know if any of it was real." Leora reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I never wanted to lie to you," she said, "but I loved him before I ever saw your throne." The words landed gently, but cut deep. That night, Alaric didn't return to his chamber. He walked the halls until dawn, the torches flickering beside him. And when the sun finally rose over the frost-covered towers, he stood at the edge of the battlements and realized that kingdoms don't fall in fire, they fall in silence. When love becomes secret and truth waits too long to be spoken. The next morning, the great hall remained empty. No court was held, no banners raised. The sun filtered through the stained glass windows, painting soft colors on stone floors that echoed with nothing but the quiet shift of dust. A silence had settled over the castle, not born of peace, but of breath held between before and after. Servants moved slower, guards whispered at their posts. Everyone sensed it. The ground beneath them was changing, but no one knew what would rise from the cracks. In her private room, Queen Isolde sat at her writing desk, quill in hand, parchment before her. She wasn't writing orders. She was writing memory, the kind of truth no record keeper dares to archive. She wrote of Edric, not as a name in dispute, but as a boy she had once seen chasing sunlight between marble columns. She wrote of Leora, whose love had never been small, only misplaced. And she wrote of Alaric, the man who had tried to carry a crown through a storm no one saw coming. Her words weren't angry. They were soft, steady. She knew the world outside the castle walls would someday ask questions, and maybe, one day, they would find this letter. Not to judge, but to understand. History, after all, is never truly about kings. It is about the hearts that beat behind their choices. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Edric played alone with wooden knights and small carved horses. Too young to know the weight of the whispers around him, yet old enough to feel them. He looked often to the door, expecting his mother, or his father, or someone to tell him what the day meant, but no one came. And so he continued his game, building a castle from blocks, then knocking it down, only to build it again. As if deep down, even without knowing why, he already understood something that took most kings a lifetime to learn. That everything, grand, even thrones, begins with small hands trying to make sense of broken pieces. Later that day, a quiet gathering took place in the inner garden. Only a few were present: Queen Isolde, Leora, the king, and a single trusted scribe. No throne, no crowd, no proclamations. Just words shared between those who had lived inside them too long. Isolde held the letter she had written and placed it gently into a wooden box, sealing it with wax. It was not a confession, it was a preservation. A way to keep what mattered from being rewritten by the noise of politics and pride. Alaric stood beside her, older now, though only weeks had passed. Grief had changed his face, but so had clarity. "He will remain heir," he said at last, "no matter whose blood made him, because he is already part of this kingdom's story." The decision did not come from love. It came from exhaustion, the kind that arrives after a man has fought too long against the tide and finally chooses to float. Leora didn't cry. She simply nodded, the softest thank you on her lips. There was no victory in her eyes, only relief that the war would stay behind closed doors. For Edric's sake, for all their sakes, Isolde, for her part, offered a hand to Leora, not as queen to subject, but as woman to woman. And in that gesture, something heavy was lifted, not erased, but softened. Under the bare trees of winter, something rare bloomed, understanding, a kind that cannot be written into law, only passed quietly through shared glances and tired hands. As the sun dipped behind the high walls, casting long shadows across the stone, the garden emptied. The scribe returned to his records, the king to his solitude, and the women to their separate wings. No bells rang. No feast followed. The kingdom would not hear what had passed. Not today. But from that moment forward, every step within the castle carried a new silence. Not the kind born of secrets, but the kind born of truths too precious to speak aloud, yet too powerful to ever forget. Years later, when Edric had grown into a quiet young man with thoughtful eyes and a voice that
rarely rose above a murmur, he returned to the old library where Queen Isolde had once spent her days.
The world had changed, new faces ruled, new banners flew, but the stone remained the same. He walked between the shelves with the calm of someone searching not for power, but for meaning. And in a small drawer behind a wall of forgotten chronicles, he found the wooden box. The wax seal had faded, but it remained untouched. He opened it slowly, hands steady, as if something inside him already knew what he was about to read. And when his eyes met the letter inside, his grandmother's handwriting, full of grace and sorrow, he didn't flinch. He read every word. Twice. Then closed the box, placed it back where he had found it, and sat quietly in the dusted light, letting truth settle beside him like a friend long overdue. He never spoke of the letter,
Never confronted Leora, never questioned the blood that ran through his veins. He understood now that some stories are not meant to be shouted. They are meant to be carried like a lantern or a scar. And so he ruled with kindness, with patience,
with a gentleness that puzzled those who had expected thunder. They never knew the silence that had raised him, the quiet strength of women who had fought wars with no swords. But he knew. And every time he looked into a mirror, he didn't see.
A lie. He saw a lineage, not perfect, but real.
Not royal by blood, perhaps, but royal by choice. And somewhere deep in the castle, past the rooms that had seen too much, past the halls where voices once broke, the wind carried a name that no longer needed to be hidden. Not shouted, just remembered. A name once crossed out, now living in the quiet between pages. And in that silence, Edric smiled, not as king, not as heir, but as someone who finally understood where he truly belonged.